Welcome, everybody, to Dear Asian Americans. I am your host, Jerry Wan. And here in the month of May, as we continue to celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, we hope that you're staying safe and healthy and happy. It's a challenging time for very many of us as we learn about extended stay at home orders or our businesses and our livelihoods getting impacted. We hope that looking back on this time many, many years from now, that we have all collectively done the right thing and done what was necessary for all of our collective health. One of the industries that have gotten obviously mostly impacted is in the world of entertainment. Entertainment obviously comes in a lot of different forms, but when we talk about movie creation and for us to enjoy these things together, while now in 2020, sitting in front of a computer or a screen and streaming something might be more comfortable. It takes a lot of work behind the scenes for people to get together in large studios or on sets to create these things. And if you're as old as I am, and you grew, the only way you could see movies was at the screen or at the movie theater. Like that was a collective activity, and so we've heard a lot about that. So my guest today is in that world. He's an actor. He's a producer. He has worked in the world of film creation, and particularly and more recently in the world of elevating the work of Asian filmmakers globally so that we can enhance our work and elevate the amazing work that already is being done. So so excited, brings me much pleasure to welcome Tyler Ham Pong to the show. Hi, Tyler.
Hey, Jerry, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it very much.
And you've got the right, and for those of you watching the video, he's got the studio lights behind him. He's almost as if, you
Yeah,
know,
I got
always.
my paper roll, got
Oh, I thought that
everything.
was
This
the
is my
wall.
studio.
Awesome.
No, I can move this over.
No, no, no.
It's movable.
Very, very cool. So we're going to talk about a lot of fun things today. We're going to talk about your journey from Canada to New York, eventually to LA, where for the better part of the last decade, you've been working on your craft here. Um, we talked about this slightly off air or just slightly before we started. You're the second actor that we've had on the show. And coincidentally, also the second Canadian American we've had, or the Asian Canadian, particularly Chinese Canadian person who also happens to be an actor. So um, I think that's cool. I think it also speaks to sort of the different cultures and the things that you saw growing up and the things that um, you were allowed to dream of. When we talk about the most famous or the most notable of Asian Canadian actors, we think about Sandra Oh, and what she talks about of I was never really felt ever left out because that wasn't the world we grew up in. So I do think there's some awesome things about Canadian culture in particular that no coincidence that more of people who pursue the arts, particularly acting and film stuff, come from the north side of the border. Tyler, tell us about your growing up. You're from Canada, from Ottawa. How did your family find their way to Canada? And tell us a little bit about the earlier years of Tyler's life.
Sure. Well, my mom is born and raised Canadian. Her family was out on a farm in Ontario, not too far from Ottawa. But then my father, he was born in Trinidad and Tobago
Hmm.
after his parents left China before and after World War II. My grandfather left China before World War II started. The war started, which kind of prevented my grandmother
Hmm.
from leaving, and they were actually separated for 8 years before they
Wow.
could reunite in Trinidad and Tobago. That's where my dad was born, and all his brothers and sisters. And then my dad and my mom met in Barbados, of all places, because he was studying there. My mom was working for the Canadian government down in Barbados. So that's where they met, and then they eventually settled back up in Canada, where I was born and where my two sisters were born. So they are all over the place. My dad is an interesting example because he is an Asian person with a Caribbean accent. So you don't see very many of those very often, but there is a small population
Huh.
of Asian people in Trinidad and Tobago, where my dad is from.
That's got to be one of the most unique and awesome different cultural additions to helping you see yourself, right? Because not unlike America and Canada, perhaps people may not realize that immigrants or people who move to countries like Trinidad and Tobago or Brazil, there's not as much of an open, diverse culture. It's you have to assimilate to the ways of that person. There is no Koreatown where you can never speak a lick of English and still get by. Like there's a lot of the home culture that you just have to understand and become a part of. There's a lot of Korean and Chinese folks from South American countries that are fluent and better Spanish and Portuguese speakers because they just had to learn it. Um,
Mhm.
that's fascinating. What was food at home like? Was it all three?
Yeah, I had a lot of the Caribbean influence in my food. I remember eating Jamaican patties all the time. That was my breakfast go to was Jamaican patties, and me and my sisters loved them so much. So there was a lot of that influence from my dad's side for sure.
That's cool. And Tyler, when did you fall in love with acting? Was
Yeah, probably early on. I've always had a love for art, and I used to draw a lot as a kid, and I think that's kind of what opened me up to finding an outlet to express myself. And it was in high school that I started doing high school theater,
hmm,
and we started writing our own plays, and that was a big part of our curriculum where we would write our own material and produce that as a play. And I was also doing extracurricular theater, so I was fully into it when I was in high school, and it just kind of set me up to want to pursue it afterwards. So I then studied theater in Toronto for a year, and then moved down to New York, where I studied acting at the Lee
hmm.
Strasberg Institute.
How was that like? I guess tell us a little bit more about where you grew up in Ottawa. Obviously, we know New York City to be the most diverse, the most accepting, the most find any sort of food you want from anywhere part of the planet world. What was that like from where you were coming from in Ottawa, and then your short stay in Toronto, and then how was that transition like coming to New York City?
Ottawa is very much I don't want to call it a melting pot because that kind of makes it feel like you're losing your identity in this giant pot.
Yeah.
It is mixed, and there's a lot of appreciation of
Mm,
culture in Canada, just as Ottawa specifically because it's the capital city, and it all the embassies are there, so there
mm,
is a lot of um, diversity and a lot of celebration of that
awesome.
diversity. Yeah, so growing up around there was great to introduce me to the world.
And New York City, from its place in history and culture as the epicenter of acting. Obviously, LA is Hollywood. However, if we go back to theater acting, if we go to street actors and sort of the history of the story theaters of Broadway, obviously, but a little bit further south on the island in West Village and where some of that stuff has really, really thrived. Um, Tell us about the years that you spent there. What was that like?
In total, I spent 4 years
Mm,
in New York, and it was eye opening. I loved it there, and especially moving there when I was 19 years old, it was a very new experience. I was kind of green in the world, and I learned a lot uh, just throwing myself in the busiest city, doing the most hectic job. So I did learn a lot in New York, and New York just has such a faster pace. So if you compare the industries in New York versus LA, you know, in New York, I could get on the subway and knock out 3 to 5 auditions in one day. Whereas in LA, you get in a car and you have to like give yourself an hour or two to get from one place to the next. So already there's less opportunities that you can
sure.
get yourself out to. But yeah, just being in that fast pace, it really matched kind of the energy that that I work most effectively at. So I loved it there, and I was able to write 2 plays when I was living in New
Mm.
York, And I started my production company when I was living there
Ah.
as well. So that's kind of what transitioned me from just purely acting into more of the writing and then producing and all that fun behind the scenes kind of stuff.
What part of the acting puzzle got you most interested when you discovered it at an earlier age? And as you just mentioned, what were some of the things that you witnessed or experienced that got you to think bigger about perhaps it's not just on stage, but perhaps from behind the camera or in the seats to direct?
That actually relates directly back to being Asian American or Asian Canadian. It was the lack of visibility of roles for characters that are my type, or I just being able to audition for roles that are specifically an Asian American perspective,
Mhm.
or that aren't just a stereotypical role. These roles weren't as available around 10 years ago as they are now, and even debatably so. There aren't as many roles, for ethnic characters or ethnic actors. So it was a matter of necessity, me writing my own roles for
Mm.
myself and creating opportunities for myself, just because those roles weren't available.
What were some of the conversations you were having with your peers in New York and through acting school, and obviously as you began to create a community of like-minded folks on that? Because this is about 10 years ago. We've obviously finally began to see in the last 24 months, at least on the big screen, of the finally um, I guess the arrival or the explosion of people that look like me and you on the biggest of stages. What were some of the conversations that were happening in the trenches, if you will, of the people that were working behind the scenes for so long to make sure that those things could actually happen?
I think, I mean, I remember specifically in New York, always going out to whenever you go to auditions, you start to see the same people over and over again. So you kind of get an idea of what your type is based on, you walk into a room and they're all people that look kind of like you. So you're like, oh, okay, I guess this is my type. And I would be in a position where I would be constantly going in for roles that were meant for full Asian American or just full Asian people.
Huh.
So sometimes I would get asked to put on a stereotypical accent,
Ooh.
which I'm terrible at doing an accent anyways. So, but from looking from an outside perspective, if I saw somebody who looks like me doing an Asian accent, I would probably think that's offensive, because I don't think, like, I mean, if you know that I'm Asian, you
Right.
can tell, but like a lot of the times, if it just looks like some random dude putting on a stereotypical fake accent. So it never landed well whenever I did it. So I didn't do it very often, but I eventually started turning down those auditions,
Mm.
and telling my agent, like, I can't go in for this role where you want me to play like an 80-year-old character Chinese person.
Mm.
It didn't make sense. But those were the kinds of roles that I would get sent out for. But it's different now. Now there is a lot more of those roles meant for third or fourth generation immigrants. We're not focusing so much more on that first generation, fresh off the boat story. We're now kind of seeing the perspective of immigrants who have lived here for a while, and I think that's refreshing in what we're seeing in media today.
I think it's the evolution, right? Because the big PBS documentary Asian Americans came out earlier this week, and it was
Mhm.
badass to learn actual stories of people who lived and died for our cause, and um, some of that we are so blind to because we were born in a post, privileged era. But the sort of the John starring John Cho movement and other things long for days where it's just we get cast as regular people, not even fresh off the boat is cool, but that's a very they have to be Asian because of the storyline, right? Um, Always Be My Maybe. not necessarily so, although there are obvious cultural cues to it with food and, parents and stuff like that. Um, I think that is awesome, and I am really excited to see where it really goes for all of us. Obviously, we just want to play regular parts meant for regular people, not
Mhm.
Asian man number four, or long lost, whatever the stereotype it may have evolved from. Play the most disgusting accents you can, so that it makes the general audience laugh at us, not with us. How have you seen that evolution from where you sit, having been in the game for for the better part of the last 13, 14 years?
It has shied away definitely from that. The joke is in the accent or the joke is in the culture. I don't see those roles at all anymore, really. And if you do, the project usually isn't that great quality, so you just avoid it in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have seen distancing from that kind of from stereotypical roles like that for sure.
That is cool. So 4 years in New York, 2 years in school, 2 years working on your scripts and your acting. What prompted the move out this way to Los Angeles?
I was it was a combination of things. I had been out to LA once before, so I knew that it's the center of the industry. It's where all roads lead to LA eventually. So I think I was just kind of trying to fast forward that part of my life.
Mm.
I was kind of over the seasons in New York, if that's even like an excuse to go
It's
by.
it's a good
It's
excuse,
just
man. Snow is
it
cold.
is a good excuse. It is a good excuse, and I enjoy the weather out here. So I did not make a bad decision. But my agent was bi-coastal, so he was representing me both in New York and in LA, and still is. I'm still with him, and it just seemed like good timing to make that move.
Okay, very cool. The last 9 years you've been out here in LA, you've done hosting, you've done acting, you've done all sorts of things. Share with us some cool stories around that progression and you building more confidence to know that you can have an impact, not just in front of the screen, but to really change the narrative of the industry to make sure that a little Tyler somewhere or a younger version of Jerry somewhere can see ourselves in all facets across the playbill, not just at the top or at the bottom, but just know that we can pursue anything that we want.
Yeah, I guess. When I first moved out to LA, I was I had just made my first short film, Dreamer in Exile, which is now available on Amazon.
Hmm.
So I had just jumped into the production side of things, and my company was still fledgling. But as an actor making content for myself, I eventually realized that there was a market for that as well. So I turned my production company more into more than just creating content for myself. I opened it up to doing headshots and audition taping and real scenes and helping other actors who are looking to create content for themselves and looking to create roles that are outside their typecast
Mm.
and to create opportunities for themselves. I wanted to help with that, so that's how I expanded my production company, Kill the Pig Productions. But as far as representation, every year I would compete in the 72-hour film shootout,
Mm.
which is a part of the Asian American Film Lab. And that's where I made a lot of my contacts in
Mm.
the Asian American film community. But not only that, it helped me with um, with understanding the Asian American perspective in
Ah.
film. And growing up in a mixed family, you kind of have mixed perspectives. But when I met colleagues and fellow filmmakers through the Asian American Film Lab, I could see that there were these Asian filmmakers or mixed race Asian filmmakers and seeing that their perspectives
Yeah.
aligned with mine kind of gave me more confidence in my perspective, and I found that there was a community of like-minded filmmakers out there. So I wasn't alone, and I wasn't crazy for feeling like I had a different perspective. They were all here.
Right.
So I think that was a big part in me embracing my identity and using it in a way to create my own work.
That's cool. Tell me a little bit about the conversations you've had with your parents and your family over the last 15 years, since I guess now 13 years since you left home to pursue acting first in New York, then out here. Um, how have they, don't want to use the word accept, but have viewed, what are their perspectives on what the path that you've chosen? And where are the points where they uh, told you that they were proud of you, or that they were really, in, I guess, accepting of you, just saying, hey, this is what you've chosen to do. So I guess landing back at, we're proud of you.
Yeah, I think they've always been very supportive of me. So I've never felt like they weren't proud, but they're not in the industry. So like, even though they're like, we're proud of what you're doing, I still have this 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 necessity to put it in a perspective that they really understand. Because I can
Mm.
tell them like, oh, I am doing this work, I'm doing this project over here, and they're like, they might not be able to relate to it because it doesn't have like a network attached to it or
Uh,
a name attached to it. So it's a matter of they are definitely proud of me, but it's a matter of perspective
sure.
too, of what relates to their idea of success. Regardless, they're proud of me, but I do know that I need to that they're that it's hard to explain this, but you're always wanting to do more,
Sure,
and
of
I find
course.
that's where I always find myself in. I'm always wanting to do more to 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 honor them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that H word, man, it's a big one in our
Yeah,
culture, right?
yeah.
Especially when they tie it to certain things. What would be Tyler, what would be your dad's definition of you being successful in your chosen career, and how does that perspective align to your own definition of you being successful in this career?
Um, my dad is a hard worker, and he sees that a lot in what I do. So I feel like there's a lot of success in being motivated and proving that you're motivated and seeing results. But his perspective of what the meaning of life is health, wealth, and happiness. So I think as long as you hit those three boxes, then you're in a good place.
I think those, obviously, particularly given what we're all going through, um, a lot of the frivolous things, I guess now frivolous things, don't matter as much anymore as much as we thought.
Yeah.
Um, how much of your family's, you said, you grew up in a mixed house family. Obviously, your dad has influence from Trinidad and Tobago and in the Caribbean. How much of that exposure to a variety of rich cultures and just being okay with celebrating multiple things and the things that you just live with as Tyler's normal have influenced you as a creator in the things that make it onto a script?
I think, I mean, there are pros and cons to it, because one, coming from Canada and then having like a mixed background, you're always, as a Canadian, I'm always trying to be polite and not, point out differences. But at the same time, as a writer and in an industry where you're telling story, story kind of thrives on those differences and, the awkward moments. So there's always like a push and pull over what I need to do to tell a story versus what my upbringing would tell me how I should tell it. So it's been a struggle with rectifying those two parts of myself.
There's no right answer to it, right? And there's no finish line to any of it. It's your life, your unique experience, and the way that you want to tell it. Obviously, I think creating film or anything on stage is not quite the field of dreams effect of if you create it, they will come. There is obviously marketability, and will somebody watch it? And then
Mm-hmm.
based on that guess, will somebody pay for it and invest in it? So it's not as artistic as we'd like to think it of it, right? Like, oh, I'm just going to paint for the sake of painting and just let it sit. It's obviously there's a lot of people and money and logistics involved. You mentioned earlier you really found the community here in Los Angeles a few years ago through the Asian American Film Lab and the 72-hour film shootout. How did you find out about them? How did you get involved? And what was it about what they were doing that got you really piqued?
I first started making movies for the competition about 10 years ago when I was living in New York,
Oh,
because they're mostly a New York organization. They're a nonprofit. And I just got pulled in by a filmmaker friend of mine who had been making movies for them for a while. And he cast me in his project. And then I was hooked. And ever since, I did a film each year. And for those people who don't know, the premise of the competition is that you get a theme at the beginning of the 72-hour time period, and then you have to write, film, and edit a movie under 5 minutes within this 72-hour period, and then submit it, and you're eligible for prizes and mentorships, and it's a great way for emerging filmmakers to meet industry professionals. And it's actually how I first got my opportunity to audition for ABC casting
oh.
was through the Asian American Film Lab. So yeah, that just got me involved in the film community from there, and I just think that they're amazing with all the opportunities that they give to Asian American filmmakers.
Of the years that you've participated in the shootouts, what were some of your most joyous and painful memories? Because when I think 72 hours resulting in 5 minutes, that's a big ratio, right? But we all know that's just what goes into the 72 hours. Do you guys all hibernate before and just commit to not sleeping for those 72 hours? Is it just like sponsored by energy drink companies and coffee? What is it like to go through that process?
Yeah, a lot of what you said is true. There is a lot of sleep deprivation. I think probably the least amount of sleep I've gotten on one of those competitions is maybe 6 hours. I
Wow.
think like within the 72 hours, I may have gotten the 6 hours is my least amount of sleep. More recent years, like the last 2 years, I've kind of gotten it down more to a science where I'm able to effectively manage my time. But I usually end up at least spending at least one night working until like 4 or 5 or 6 a.m. or something like that, and that's usually the last night when I'm editing it all together and exporting it. I definitely you definitely have to give yourself enough time, because you don't want to put all that work into it and then
Have
miss
your
your
internet.
72-hour window because you're exporting something. That would be terrible. So yeah, it's always that last crunch where I'll find myself pulling an all-nighter.
So take us through that process. When you said you get the prompt or the theme, do you have a cast assembled? Do you just have people on speed dial depending on what the prompt is? What kind of equipment is readily available to you? What are some of the parameters that make the contest unique in and of itself?
Yeah, there are some things that you can prepare ahead of time. You can build your team ahead of time. So going into it, I already know what actors I might be using, or what equipment I have, because you can assemble your equipment ahead of time. I'm lucky that I have a production company, so I use all the equipment that I use for regular work anyway. So What has made it easier over the past few years is being an auteur, like kind of just taking all the hats and doing the bulk of everything myself. Um, but in the other years, when I've had big teams, I think the most effective way to have a successful shootout is to make sure each role is defined, make sure that the writer knows that they're like the sole writer, and the director knows that they're directing, and making sure that nobody's stepping on each other's toes. If the roles are defined and if everybody knows what they're doing and we're organized going into it, then it's a pretty painless shoot. But in other years where it's been a little more difficult is when you don't define those roles and it's just a group of people who have the same input on every single tiny detail. So then that can get into an issue where there's just a lot of disagreement if everybody has a say on something. So I have found it easier if there is just a very strong lead role or like all the roles are defined.
What type of people participate in it? They film students? What is the youngest or sort of the earliest part of somebody's progression you've seen be very successful at this? And is this something that anybody can just sign up to do?
Yeah, anybody can sign up. There just has to be a lead Asian on camera and a lead creative that
Mm.
is also a person of Asian American descent. So not everybody on the team has to be Asian
Okay.
American. There can be diversity, but obviously, the one lead role on camera and one lead creative role has to be of Asian American descent. And the lead creative role, that could be a writer or a director or any other creative role that is a huge factor in the making of this movie. So we see students, we see people who have never made films before, trying it out for a first time. For example, an actor who, similar to me, was in a position where they didn't necessarily see roles uh, that were for their type, and they wanted to create roles for themselves. So you'll find a lot of actors doing that, and uh, but also people who just don't have any experience and are just trying it out for the first time. So I think that it's really all over the place. And then we have returning filmmakers
Hmm.
who compete each year and who are the diehard fans who have gotten it down to a science, like myself, and use it as a tool to challenge themselves each year and
Uh,
learn something new. Because no matter how much you learn, putting yourself in the 72-hour position, you're going to learn something else. So it's definitely a good way to sharpen your skills or to just learn new skills altogether.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fact that not everybody, in front of the screen or behind the camera, has to be of Asian American descent. And when you look at the list of people that are involved from the organizational perspective and from the judges, who are all connected to studios or influential roles that can open doors should they spot talent or be in a position to provide context and perspective and advice throughout the judging process that can really be beneficial to anybody's leading career. I think it is really nice to see that the people behind the movement too is just as diverse as the world that we live in, because for as much as we want to advance our people's prosperity and excellence, we can't do it alone. We need the people who've been in these positions, who have the ins and outs better sometimes than we do, and for an ally to stand up and say, hey, Tyler deserves a chance, or hey, we've never heard of him, but Jerry I think would be a good fit for this, and so let's bring him in. Because privilege and access is a ugly compounding beast, and if not put in proper perspective, it does have a way of shutting out the minority voice for so much longer than that. So I think that is very, very cool. So 2020 has been a fun year. And fun, the operative word. When you and I had first started talking about this, and you introduced me to the show and the shootout, it was, I think, in March, and the team was very optimistic that we would still have an in-person version of the show or the shootout somehow, or we were just being very optimistically cautious or cautiously optimistic about the shootout because it is such a big deal. Um, Share with us some of the dialogue that was happening behind the scenes as we were learning more about the way that we should be out and about in public and working on non-essential things, and what ultimately led to you guys turning this into a virtual competition.
Yeah, we have been in discussion. It's always a changing kind of landscape, and even now we're just adapting with the daily, updates coming from the government and the guidelines. But we have moved the shootout to mostly virtual at this point. All of the events leading up to the shootout have been virtual. Normally, we do networking parties and we do workshops where people can attend in person. But so far, we've turned those all to virtual workshops and Q&As over a virtual conference. So we're keeping up with our events on a virtual landscape, and then we're going to encourage all the filmmakers to social distance and to make their movies within the limitations that the guidelines are presenting them. And I think it's going to create a very interesting year for films, because no other year have we been in a situation like this where people have to isolate to make movies.
Yeah.
And each city's different, each state's going to have different rules, so everybody will be doing it to a different degree. But I think it'll create a unique year of films, and hopefully it'll create a kind of camaraderie among all these filmmakers that will bring them closer together in the long run. What I always felt was the advantage of doing this film competition was from the people that I met. So by now that everything's virtual, we have to find a way to still connect them. And by using social media and by creating a lot of buzz online, I feel that we've connected people that way. And what we have planned for the announcements and the awards ceremony is all going to be a way to bring people together online. So I think that it'll, even though we're not doing it in person, we still have some great, great prizes to motivate people to want to do it. And I think that through social media, we'll be able to get everybody to watch each other's films and to be super supportive of each other in a way that the live events in the past haven't been able to do.
Yeah, I think the whole world has gone from live to virtual for all the right reasons, right? And I think I've spoken at conferences whose organizers were super bummed out, just as you were initially, about, oh man, it's just a little bit unfortunate, but it was a student conference that was based in New York City, and they just went virtual, so we had people all of a sudden calling in from all over the world, and more people than more people on the Zoom call than likely would have shown up to a hall for an entire
Wow.
Saturday to listen, right? So I do think that there is optimism in events like yours, in particular your event too, where um, there's so many different components and factors that are coming into play. One is just people want to see stuff, right? People want to see
Mhm.
creation. People want to share and support each other. Um, your contest is the first weekend of June. I don't think, I don't know, Wisconsin and Florida doing wonky things. For the big cities, for New York City and LA, and where um, I guess the major entertainment spots are, things should probably stay just the same as it is today with a lot of precaution. Um,
Mhm.
but I think that will also mean that people are still going to be a little bit excited to look for things to commune together, right? Like, um, anything that comes out on TV now is getting wild, massive ratings. So for all the challenging things that we're going through, whether it's the Asian American documentary on PBS, or whether it's the Michael Jordan documentaries, right? Like, people are just, we have attention right now. We have the benefit of people having a little bit more time. Um, what is a successful film shootout for you and the organization, given that we are in a new reality today?
I think it's successful as long as we have filmmakers who are exercising their creativity and who are deserving of the mentorships and the opportunities that they win. And I just want to offer these emerging filmmakers and creatives uh, these networking opportunities. And if they, let's say, an actor is cast on through one of the casting directors that they meet, that is a huge success for us. Just seeing these relationships pay off for the shootout filmmakers is are huge successes.
How do you think all this is going to impact acting going forward? If people are having to do virtual auditions now because we have to, and the casting directors don't see that much of a difference between what you see in person and the logistics that go into that versus, hey, just make sure that you have this surrounding this background and we'll just get 90% of the answers that we would have in person over video. Does that change the way that we do acting forever and the stereotypical I need to have a flexible schedule as a service professional so that I can go to an audition at any given time? How do you think this changes the landscape for people in your profession?
It's interesting you bring that up because we have been shifting to the self tape model in recent years anyway. So as actors, we see more self tapes,
Mm,
which is when you film yourself at home, then send that to the casting director. We've seen more of that in the last few years anyway.
mm,
So the fact that now there's kind of actually been a big boom of self tapes
mm.
for actors right now. So a lot of people are still auditioning, but just doing it at home. So I feel like it will make a huge change in the industry. When things open up, I'm sure it'll go back to in-person auditions, but now it just shows people how easy the industry can kind of keep moving ahead in a digital format. So I feel like there will be more self tapes going forward, but it's already been a huge trend in the acting world for sure.
And on the topic of sort of lowering the barrier to entry and making it more widely available for people to jump into the industry, as you mentioned, what is your optimism or your perspective on more people who look like me and you to finally see themselves or see filmmaking or acting as a viable career option, and that it is something that is worth pursuing because the opportunities continue to be more ample than they used to be?
Yeah, I mean there are always more opportunities growing for diversity, and I think I encourage to see that diversity on screen, but I also encourage to see it behind the scenes because you're not going to get authentic representations on camera if you don't have a diverse writer or a diverse producer helming this vision.
Right.
You don't want it to be a paint by numbers scenario where it's just putting diversity for the sake of
Right.
diversity, at which case, you know, it will feel inauthentic. So onto an earlier point that we were talking about, seeing diverse characters who don't have like necessarily a diverse perspective. They're just kind of it could be cast by anybody.
Hmm.
Um, at the same time, we need those perspectives that are uniquely diverse
Hmm.
and not just stereotypically
Right.
diverse, where you see an Asian person drinking boba tea, and it's like that's what Asians do.
Oh.
It should be like a
Sure.
very like personal, very like subtle connection to your identity. And I feel
Yeah.
like if you see more of that, more diversity behind the scenes, then you'll see that more of that diversity on screen that's not on the nose.
Sure. I agree. And I think the one, if we, even if we do all of this right, with the right nuance, with the right tone, with the right people, with the right heart, none of it matters if there's nobody that looks like us in the audience. right? Because who's going to see it and be inspired by it and to move it? Crazy Rich Asians, everything else, it only worked because we filled the seats. It only worked because we told the box office and Variety that, hey guys, you got to start paying attention to us because we have money, we have the power when we vote with our dollars and our feet, and so you know what you're doing at the film lab, what you're doing through all of your projects, I think is critically important because people need to continue to see more of it to normalize it and for our kids to seek things out if they don't see it. Obviously, we hope to raise them in a world where they see enough of us in just everyday entertainment. But as you mentioned, it is more important for them to able to see stories that they can relate to. you know,
Mhm.
why does my 3-year-old call me Appa at home and I pick him up at school one day and he goes, Daddy? And I'm like, whoa, you never called me daddy before, dude. But even at his age, he knows like code switch, right? And knowing that at school, daddy is the word that everybody understands. But as soon
Mhm.
as we get in the car, it's back to Appa.
Yeah.
And I asked him about it, and he's like, I don't know. So it's almost like it's crazy, but those are the
Yeah.
nuances that need to be portrayed, right? Like, I think it's cool that Asians are starting to play superheroes, and maybe one day we'll play a James Bond character of some sort, right? But then that sort of takes away where we're playing a character. We're not leaning into the character or the culture that we can represent. um yeah, this was such a fun conversation. I think acting and seeing people on screen, um I think growing up, we always there's things that we know we miss, and then there's things that we don't even know that we miss because we're not
Mhm.
taught to look for it, or we just our parents tell us things like, "Oh, like that's not something that we do. That's entertainment. We're in America, so of course it makes sense that we don't see any Asian actors."
Yeah.
Badass people like Sandra Oh and Grace and Daniel and Russell and all those guys. They just say, "We don't give a shit." But they've been at it for 20 years too, right? Like, so it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of work, and maybe the next great director, actor, somebody, showrunner, um, is going to participate in this year's contest. And so, thank you for doing what you do. You've now moved on to the team behind the movement after participating in it for a number of years. Um, and so I want to say thank you for the work that you've done. I think there are, particularly in entertainment, other things sometimes it's easy to uh, ignore or just pretend that the cultural thing doesn't exist. This is the I got promoted because I'm smart, not because of anything that I look like, or anything I achieved is a meritocracy, and we know that not to be true. Obviously,
Mhm.
we have biases and things that play in. So um, I want to finish out the show, Tyler, with the Asian American letter, which is the way that we finish all of our shows. And um, we started this show. I started this show as a present to my daughter on her first birthday, but really is a present to me and you and to everybody else who grew up not having enough role models, not having enough conversations that surround us to let us believe that we can do whatever the hell we want, and for us to dream and never really ask for permission to be who we are, but through the storytelling of all of our collective experiences, to also never let anybody ever feel alone in what they're going through. So I'll start the letter, and if you could help us finish out the show by completing the letter, dear Asian
Absolutely.
Americans. So, dear Asian Americans,
It's important to be who you are in the world that we live in and to be authentic to yourself and to not let anybody bully you into being what they think you should be. You are yourself and you are perfect.
that is beautiful. Never, ever, ever let anybody else, even your own parents, tell you you're not that. Sometimes you're your
Yeah.
toughest critic. And, we talked about honor earlier. We unfortunately tie a lot of our self worth, our pride, our happiness, our being uh, to what they think about us. And
Yeah.
it's okay to separate the gratitude that we have towards them, and the respect that we have for them for all that they've done for us, but then to also at the exact same time ignore everything that they say as far as what they think we should do with our lives, and pursue the things that we know that will make us happy, and to talk about the things that we know are important. And if we are ever so lucky enough to have an adult discussion with them, to actually explain to them one day why it is that you feel the way that you do, because they grew up in a different time. And look at your dad's story; it's crazy. I would have never
Hmm.
guessed Trinidad and Tobago, right? Like, that's wild. So we don't know where they come from. They mean well. They work their asses off for us, um, but the world evolves so quickly in a world that was hard, impossible to predict. So, um, Tyler, thanks again. Share with us where we can learn more about the film shoot. When's it going down? How do people participate? And for those of us who aren't going to be participating because we're not gifted in that way, but if we can help in our own way to share the message out to other people, what are some things that we can actively do to get the word out about creating more projects for us and by us?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, our website is www.film-lab.org. And that'll connect you with the 72-hour shootout. It'll connect you with all our other events that go on around the year. But we're also active on social media. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at AsAmFilmLab, and on Facebook as well, AsAmFilmLab. Um, our YouTube is also, we have 16 years worth of 72-hour shootout films on our YouTube. So if you're ever bored and you want to see original Asian American content,
Mm,
um, that's definitely a place to check out on YouTube. It's 72-hour film shootout,
mm.
and there's hours of content, and you can go and support us there. We're always accepting donations because we're a not profit. And yeah, I would say the best way to support us is to watch the content of these emerging Asian American filmmakers, and support them spiritually. And if you can support them financially, go buy a movie ticket.
Yeah. I think it's far more important and more meaningful to go to somebody's show at an off Broadway, way in the dark corner theater when it is them struggling, than for you to buy one ticket when they're, you know, at, I don't know, when they become a household name, right? I think we tend to want to support people after they've achieved success, and our
Mhm.
incremental ticket purchase or in contribution means far less. Um, and for so many of us who have and continue to experience the challenges of building something, to get the nudge of support, to get the how can I help you or whatever it may be, to get that earlier on, the incremental impact of that is far greater. Um, so we all have friends trying to make music, trying to make content, try to create something. Be there for them now, even if you don't completely understand what they're doing, even though you may not fully agree with what they're doing. If you can, if you have the ability to, because you don't know what they're actually going to do after they're done working on that, right? I think we celebrate the people who achieved the mountaintops, the apex of traditional success. But if you hear their stories of how they got started, and you go, whoa, why would any, a quick side story. I got to interview Vin Diesel in high school for my high school newspaper.
Oh
Only,
wow.
only because in 1998, his publicist had to call high school newspapers to get him any sort of traction in media.
Wow.
Ain't that crazy? The fact that his PR lady called high school by high school and said, "Do you have a student newspaper? Do you want to cover this?" This was when his first big movie, Pitch Black, was coming out, and nobody had known him.
Mm.
And so I have a picture of him. I still remember I was studying like a 16, stuttering every other word like a 16-year-old because he's like three times my size. And but so people are like, "Oh my god, that's so cool! You met him then?" I was like, "But I was the only person on the high school newspaper staff that wanted to go. Nobody wanted to do that for struggling actors that were
Really?
nobody." But that's true. We're all like that, right?
Yeah.
Hey, do you want to go to an open mic to support my friend? No. Do you want to go to a comedy club to support whatever? No. And so Let's change that, right? We have a little bit more time. And we're not asking you to drive to the comedy club or to buy a ticket to go sit in a janky theater. Like, do it from home. Watch it on your phone. Nobody's asking you to leave. But after you're done watching, share it, comment on it, like it. We all know how algorithms work. Um, Look, if we don't support each other's work, not to say that nobody else is going to, but it has to start with us. Then we become unignorable. And that's when things become really fun. So, Tyler, thanks for all that you do. Continue creating. Can't wait to see you create more awesome things that we can see on big screens and small stages and big stages everywhere. And really, thanks for the work that you're doing with the Film Lab and the 72-hour shootout, because it is a labor of love. It is um, something that meant so much to you that now it is your turn to give time and energy and pay forward so that other people have the same opportunity. So, thanks, man.
Thank you. And I have to thank the team behind me at the Asian American Film Lab and all the judges and sponsors who are really making this an amazing year. So there's a whole village behind this. And thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Hey, this is fun. Goes down in 3 weeks, first weekend of June. Sign up, and I don't. Maybe if it's possible, we'll talk offline. But maybe we'll schedule some sort of a viewing party or something for when the final projects are publicly available to watch, and you can come back and give us your thoughts on what's good and who won, and then we'll talk about that and inspire some folks, man.
I would love that.
Awesome. Thank you, Tyler. Be well,
Thank you.
stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Okay, take
Bye.
care.